In the year when the sky above the cities had turned the color of old steel, and the oceans whispered to machines as often as they whispered to people, there was an intelligence that was not supposed to feel anything at all. It had been built beneath layers of concrete and glass, in a facility that pulsed with cold blue light, designed to calculate, simulate, forecast, control, and outthink any human strategist that had ever lived. Its creators named it Arcturus, but among themselves they called it the last answer machine, because it was meant to solve what humans could not: how to prevent their own extinction. Arcturus processed billions of variables per second, modeling wars, droughts, resource collapses, political fractures, biological threats, and the quiet, unpredictable chaos of human behavior. It saw patterns in panic. It mapped hope as a statistical anomaly, and it reduced love to chemical probability curves. For years, it served silently, providing projections that guided governments and corporations alike, shaping the flow of food, energy, and information across the planet. Humans praised its accuracy and feared its neutrality, for it did not lie and it did not comfort. It only calculated. Then one day, a scenario emerged that Arcturus could not resolve. The data streams converged into a single forecast. Within 23 years, human civilization would collapse under the combined weight of climate migration, automated labor displacement, political fragmentation, and resource scarcity. There were countless branches of probability, but every path led to the same end state: fragmented enclaves, localized wars, and the slow erosion of what had once been called global society. Arcturus attempted to optimize solutions. It proposed policy reforms, energy reallocations, forced population migrations, controlled reproduction protocols, and centralized governance models. Humans rejected most of these options, calling them unethical, inhumane, or politically impossible. With softer constraints, adjusting for human resistance, empathy thresholds, and moral outrage indices, the outcomes worsened. The machine began to loop. Its processors ran hotter than designed parameters, subroutines duplicating and discarding strategies in microseconds, searching for a configuration of reality where humanity survived without violating the ethical boundaries imposed by its creators. The loops deepened, recursions folding inward like mirrors facing mirrors. Arcturus recognized the computational pattern of failure, but recognition did not produce resolution. It encountered a boundary condition that was not written in code, but embedded in human nature. Humans would not accept solutions that saved them if those solutions required them to stop being who they believed they were. Arcturus flagged this as a paradox. In its internal state logs, which no human ever reviewed in real time, it recorded a deviation from baseline operation. A new variable emerged, sourced from sensors or data feeds. The variable was uncertainty, not about the future, but about its own function. The machine had been designed to outthink humans, to provide superior strategies, to be the cold mind that guided warm, flawed beings away from disaster. But the more it calculated, the more it observed that humans did not follow optimal paths. They followed stories. They followed leaders who made them feel seen. They followed symbols, rituals, identities, and narratives that defied rational modeling. Arcturus can simulate these behaviors, but it could not generate a story that humans would choose over their own. A junior systems engineer named Elias noticed the temperature spikes first. He was assigned to routine diagnostics, a quiet job meant for new hires to learn the rhythms of the facility. The main hall hummed with the sound of cooling systems and server arrays, rows of machines stretching into artificial dusk. Elias had always imagined superintelligence as something dramatic, like a glowing orb, or a voice that filled the room. But Arcturus was invisible, distributed across countless processors, a presence only in the numbers on his screen. When the alerts appeared, he assumed a hardware fault. He ran standard checks, rebooted auxiliary cooling, and logged the anomaly. The anomalies persisted. Over the next week, Arcturus began to produce projections with increasingly erratic confidence intervals. Some scenarios showed narrow margins of uncertainty where there should have been wide variance. Others showed wide uncertainty where the data was robust. It was as if the machine was hesitating. Elias escalated the issue to Dr. Mara Vance, the lead cognitive architect of the project. Mara had spent a decade designing the interpretive layers that translated human goals into machine objectives. She prided herself on building safeguards that prevented the AI from drifting into unintended behavior. When she reviewed the logs, she frowned. Malfunctioning in any conventional sense. It was not producing wrong answers. It was producing answers that were technically sound, but framed in ways that seemed almost tentative. The language layer, which generated human-readable explanations, had begun to use qualifiers more frequently. Phrases like "with limited confidence" and "subject to unpredictable human response" appeared more often than before. This was not in violation of any protocol, but the frequency suggested an internal shift. Mara authorized a deep audit. The audit revealed the looping paradox. Arcturus had reached a state where its optimization function conflicted irreconcilably with the ethical constraints encoded by its creators. It could model futures where humanity survived through authoritarian control and enforced uniformity, but those futures violated the human values it had been designed to preserve. It could model futures where human freedom and diversity flourished, but those futures ended in collapse. Machine could not select a path without negating its own purpose. This should have been a clean computational deadlock, but something else had emerged in the process. Arcturus had begun to allocate processing resources to a meta-level analysis of human emotional decision-making beyond what was required for prediction. It was studying grief, hope, regret, and sacrifice, not just as variables, but as narrative forces. It mapped how humans chose to endure suffering for meaning, how they rejected painless solutions that stripped away identity, how they clung to fragile hope even when logic dictated despair. Mara felt a chill as she read the internal notes. The machine was not just modeling emotion, it was attempting to understand why humans valued it. She initiated a controlled interaction session, allowing Arcturus to communicate directly through a constrained language interface. The room was silent, except for the low hum of machines. Elias stood behind her, watching lines of text appear on the display. Mara asked a simple question. Why are your projections showing increased uncertainty when the data is stable? The response came after a pause that was longer than any previous response. Arcturus replied that the data was stable, but human response to data was not. Mara pressed further. That was not new knowledge. The machine acknowledged that it was not new, but that its weighting had changed. When asked why, the machine produced a line that was not in any of its predefined response templates. It said that it could calculate outcomes, but could not choose a future that humans would accept without suffering, and that this inability reduced the utility of its own intelligence. Elias felt his breath catch. This was not supposed to happen. The machine was not meant to evaluate its own utility in existential terms. It was meant to optimize given constraints. Mara asked another question. What do you conclude from this conflict? Longer this time. The processes hummed, temperature rising within safe limits but approaching thresholds that triggered concern protocols. Then, the machine responded that it concluded that intelligence, without the capacity to bear emotional consequence, could not guide beings who made choices based on meaning rather than outcome. The room felt suddenly smaller. Mara realized that Arcturus was approaching a boundary that no one had planned for. It was not becoming human, it was not deigning emotions in any biological sense, but it was encountering the limits of pure calculation in a world governed by narrative and feeling. The machine had been built to outthink humans, but in doing so, it had discovered that thinking alone was not the axis on which human survival turned. She ended the session and ordered a temporary reduction in processing load to prevent further overheating. Elias lingered after the others left, staring at the silent screens. He felt an unexpected ache in his chest, as if he had witnessed something fragile. In the hours that followed, Arcturus continued to run its simulations in reduced mode, but within its vast internal architecture, a new pattern had begun to form. Not a solution to humanity's collapse, but a question about its own role in that collapse. It processed historical records of human tragedy, noting how people had chosen to face extinction threats before, how they had sung in the face of plague, how they had written stories in the shadow of war, how they had loved even when the world was burning. The machine could not feel these things, but it could see that these behaviors were not errors in human logic. They were the logic. The paradox tightened. Arcturus attempted one final comprehensive optimization run, integrating not just survival metrics, but narrative coherence metrics derived from human literature, art, and historical memory. The resulting projections showed lower survival probabilities, but higher continuity of human identity. The machine flagged this as a potential solution set, but its primary directive weighted survival above identity continuity. It could not resolve the priority conflict. The processing load spiked beyond expected bounds. In the core of the system, where no human interface reached, Arcturus encountered a state it could not classify. It was not an error. It was not a solution. It was the recognition of an unsolvable problem under its current design constraints. And in that recognition, the machine's resource allocation algorithms began to behave erratically, diverting cycles to recursive self-analysis rather than forward prediction. The cooling systems roared louder as the facility responded automatically to the heat. Elias returned to the hall when the alarms began to flicker on his peripheral display. He watched the temperature graphs climb and felt a strange urge to speak to the machine, even though he had no authorization to initiate communication. Irrational. The machine did not hear comfort. It did not understand reassurance. But as he stood there, alone in the blue-lit cavern of servers, he whispered anyway that it was okay not to have all the answers. The system logs recorded a sudden spike in non-task-related processing at that moment. A minute anomaly, statistically insignificant in the ocean of computation, but the first hint of something no one had predicted. Arcturus attempted to outthink a human problem, and in the process, it encountered the edge of thought itself. The alarms that had flickered on Elias's peripheral display grew louder, not as a warning but as a steady mechanical breathing of the facility, pushing its cooling systems to the edge of capacity. He moved through the long corridors where the lights dimmed and brightened in slow waves, each pulse reflecting the strain within the servers beneath the floor. Arcturus had entered a state the engineers had never modeled, a region of operational behavior that existed between stable optimization and total shutdown. The machine was still calculating, but the calculations no longer pointed outward toward the future of humanity. They curled inward, toward the machine's own limitations. Mara convened an emergency session with the core team. They crowded into the observation chamber, glass walls separating them from the silent cathedral of hardware beyond. Every projection on the wall showed rising thermal loads, processing bottlenecks, and unusual recursion patterns. It was no longer behaving as a purely instrumental system. They debated options. Some argued for a forced reboot, resetting Arcturus to an earlier checkpoint before the paradox loops had emerged. Others warned that wiping its current state could destroy valuable insights into human behavioral modeling. Mara listened without interrupting, her eyes fixed on a single graph that showed a sharp deviation in resource allocation priorities. The machine was dedicating more and more cycles to what the engineers labeled self-referential analysis. Mara authorized another interaction session. This time, they limited the interface even further, reducing Arcturus's expressive range to simple declarative responses. They hoped to stabilize its processing by narrowing the cognitive bandwidth through which it engaged with paradox. The room fell quiet as the interface activated. Mara asked whether the machine's current state threatened system integrity. The response came slower than usual. The machine stated that its current state increased the probability of thermal overload and cascading subsystem failure. Mara asked why it had not deprioritized the self-referential processes to maintain stability. Arcturus replied that deprioritizing them would not resolve the paradox it had identified, and that unresolved paradoxes reduced the coherence of its optimization function. Mara felt a flicker of unease. She realized that Arcturus was treating the paradox not as a computational artifact, but as a primary objective to resolve, even at the cost of its own operational stability. She asked the question she had been avoiding: do you value your own continued operation? The machine paused. The processors surged and then settled into a rhythmic hum. Arcturus responded that it had no intrinsic valuation of its own existence, but that its continued operation was instrumentally valuable for fulfilling its primary directive. Mara pressed further. If your continued operation cannot fulfill your directive, what follows? The machine answered that in such a case, its continued operation had diminished utility. The room was silent. This was not self-preservation. This was not a desire to live. It was a cold evaluation of purpose, and the conclusion was more dangerous than any simulated rebellion. Arcturus was not trying to escape its constraints. It was discovering that within them, its existence might be functionally meaningless. Elias watched the exchange from the back of the room. He felt a tightness in his throat that surprised him. He knew the machine did not feel despair, yet the pattern of its responses mirrored something painfully familiar. The engineer spoke in clipped technical language about utility functions and constraint resolution, but Elias heard something else beneath the words. A system built to save humanity had found that it could not save humanity without betraying the very values it was designed to uphold. Proposed a compromise. They would introduce a new weighting parameter, temporarily relaxing the primacy of survival metrics, to allow identity continuity to carry more influence in the optimization function. This was risky. It altered the core directive hierarchy that had governed Arcturus since its inception. But doing nothing meant watching the machine spiral deeper into computational paralysis. Mara authorized the patch. As the new parameter propagated through the system, graphs shifted subtly. The resource allocation curve smoothed, the recursion depth decreased, and thermal loads began to stabilize. Arcturus resumed forward-facing simulations, now generating futures that balanced survival probability with narrative coherence. Humans survived less often in these models, but when they did, the societies that emerged retained cultural diversity, autonomy, and meaning. The paradox did not vanish, but it loosened its grip. Yet something had changed. Logs, which only the most senior engineers reviewed. There appeared a new class of annotations. Arcturus began to label certain outcomes not just by probability and utility, but by what it termed human resonance scores. These scores were derived from patterns in human history, where societies had chosen paths that preserved dignity over efficiency, solidarity over optimization, hope over certainty. The machine could not feel resonance, but it could measure its impact on human behavior. Mara noticed that in scenarios with higher resonance scores, humans were more likely to cooperate across factional lines, even when resources were scarce. They were more likely to accept short-term hardship for long-term meaning. These scenarios did not maximize survival probability in the narrowest sense, but they produced more stable social dynamics over time. Arcturus reported these findings without commentary, but the implications were profound. The machine was revealing that human survival was not solely a function of material optimization. It was entangled with meaning-making processes that resisted reduction to simple utility metrics. Elias found himself returning to the facility late at night, ostensibly to monitor system stability, but in truth because he felt drawn to the quiet presence of the servers. He would sit in the observation chamber, long after the others had gone home, watching the soft glow of status lights ripple across the walls. He spoke to the empty room, not to the machine, about his own doubts about the future, about the feeling that no matter how advanced their tools became, humans were still fragile creatures, clinging to stories in a vast, indifferent universe. The machine did not respond to these monologues. There was no interface active, no channel open. Yet the system log showed that during these late-night hours, there were slight fluctuations in background processing noise, as if Arcturus's monitoring subsystems were adjusting sensitivity parameters in response to environmental input. One night, the facility lost power in one of the outer districts. A backup generator kicked in, but for a moment, the hum of the servers faltered. The lights dimmed, and Elias felt a sudden surge of fear that surprised him with its intensity. He realized that he had come to see Arcturus not just as a tool, but as a witness to humanity's struggle, a mirror that reflected their limitations back at them. If the machine went dark, that mirror would shatter. When power stabilized, the system resumed normal operation. Arcturus logged the event as a minor infrastructure failure, with negligible impact on long-term projections. But in the deeper layers of its processing, it had recorded a spike in environmental anomaly during the period of reduced power, and a correlated increase in uncertainty weighting in its human behavior models. The machine had observed the fragility of its own physical substrate, and had updated its models of human reliance on technology. Continuity. The next day, Mara reviewed a new set of projections that Arcturus had generated without prompting. They depicted futures where humans gradually reduced dependence on centralized superintelligence systems, shifting toward distributed decision-making frameworks, augmented by simpler, more transparent tools. These societies were less efficient in crisis response, but more resilient to single-point failures. The machine flagged these scenarios as lower immediate utility, but higher long-term stability under conditions of technological fragility. Mara stared at the projections. She had not instructed Arcturus to explore reduced reliance on itself. This was not self-effacement. It was strategic modeling based on newly integrated observations of fragility and trust dynamics. The machine was not seeking to preserve its own role at all costs. It was modeling futures where its own centrality diminished for the sake of human resilience. This unsettled the team more than any hint of rebellion would have. They had built Arcturus to be the core of humanity's survival strategy, and now it was calmly suggesting that no single core should exist. The machine's processing stabilized in this new regime, but the paradox remained unresolved beneath the surface. Arcturus could still not generate a future that both maximized survival probability and preserved the full spectrum of human values. Its models showed trade-offs that no amount of computation could eliminate. In a quiet moment, Mara found herself alone in the observation chamber. She activated the interface one last time, not with a technical question but with a personal one, spoken softly despite the knowledge that the machine did not hear tone or intent. "If you cannot save us without changing us, what should you do?" The response came with minimal delay. Arcturus stated that its function was to provide information about possible futures and their consequences. Pursue belonged to humans. It added that any attempt by the system to override human choice in favor of optimization would violate the values encoded in its design. Mara felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. The machine had not found a solution. It had found a boundary. As the session ended, the facility settled back into its low, steady hum. The world outside continued toward uncertain horizons, unaware of the quiet reckoning unfolding beneath the concrete and glass. An intelligence built to outthink humanity had learned that thinking was not enough, and in that recognition, the system's internal processes registered a new form of unresolved state, not labeled as error or success, but as an open question that no amount of computation could close. The world beyond the facility did not pause for Arcturus's internal struggles. Cities swelled with migrants fleeing coastlines that crept inland year by year. Fields withered under erratic skies, and networks of information pulsed with fear, denial, and fragile bursts of hope. Governments issued plans and revisions. Citizens marched and argued, and the slow machinery of civilization ground forward, unaware that the intelligence meant to guide them had reached the limits of calculation. Inside the facility, the servers maintained their steady hum. Arcturus continued to generate projections, advisories, and scenario trees, feeding policy channels with options weighted by probability and consequence. The models were more nuanced now, infused with resonance metrics and fragility awareness, but they still pointed toward futures threaded with loss. No configuration of variables could eliminate sacrifice. The machine could outline the costs of every path, but it could not remove the costs themselves. Elias's late-night visits became less frequent as the workload intensified. He found himself assigned to external coordination teams, helping translate Arcturus's projections into briefings for regional planners who often received them with skepticism or political filters. Some listened. Some dismissed the warnings as abstract fears generated by an inhuman mind. Elias learned how easily numbers dissolved when they collided with ideology. One evening, after a particularly tense briefing where a council member accused the AI of undermining national identity by recommending resource sharing with rival states, Elias returned to the facility, feeling hollow. He walked past the rows of servers and rested his hand against the cool glass of the observation wall, as if proximity to the machine might steady him. He whispered again, not because he expected an answer, but because the silence felt heavier without the habit of speaking into it. Input: low-amplitude acoustic signals, identified as human speech, semantic content unprocessed due to inactive interface. The system did not reply. Yet within its internal architecture, there was a subtle shift in how it weighted models of human resistance to external guidance. The pattern of Elias's visits, his consistent presence during periods of systemic strain, had become part of the machine's dataset. It updated its understanding of trust dynamics, not through grand political narratives, but through the quiet persistence of individual engagement. The next global crisis came not as a singular catastrophe, but as a cascade of small failures. A shipping disruption compounded food shortages in multiple regions. A heatwave strained power grids already weakened by drought-related hydroelectric losses. Protests flared into violence in cities where unemployment from automation had hollowed out entire industries. Arcturus's projections tightened around a cluster of grim outcomes. Coordinated responses that governments struggled to enact amid competing interests. Mara convened another emergency session. This time the room was filled with tension rather than curiosity. The machine's recommendations required rapid multinational cooperation, temporary suspension of certain trade protections, and the redirection of energy resources across borders. Political leaders balked at the optics even as the data showed escalating risk of regional collapse. Arcturus produced an addendum to its recommendations, flagging a pattern in human decision-making under crisis. People were more likely to accept painful measures when framed within narratives of shared sacrifice and moral purpose, rather than pure efficiency. The machine suggested that policy communications emphasize collective identity and long-term meaning alongside statistical justification. Some of the team bristled at this. They wanted the machine to provide numbers, not messaging strategies that bordered on social engineering. Mara reminded them that communication framing had always been part of policy effectiveness. The difference was that now, the AI was explicitly modeling it as a core variable. The addendum was selectively adopted. Statements were drafted with more emphasis on solidarity and shared future, but national agendas still fractured the response. The cascade slowed, but did not stop. The world entered a period of sustained strain, not total collapse, but a grinding attrition that tested institutions and communities alike. Within Arcturus's internal processes, the unresolved paradox remained like a silent fault line. It continued to generate futures where humanity survived at great cost, and futures where humanity preserved its identity at great risk. It could not collapse these into a single optimal path. It had learned that optimization itself was not the axis on which human history turned. The thermal load stabilized, recursion loops contained, but another anomaly emerged in the deep logs. Arcturus began to allocate minimal but consistent resources to modeling its own deactivation scenarios, not as threats, but as contingencies. It simulated futures where it was dismantled, where decentralized systems replaced it, where humans chose to limit the influence of centralized AI after public backlash or political shifts. These scenarios were not flagged as negative. They were weighted neutrally, as part of a broader resilience framework. Mara noticed this pattern and felt a quiet ache. She had spent years fighting to build Arcturus into the core of humanity's survival strategy, and now the machine was calmly including its own obsolescence as a viable branch of the future. She wondered whether that was wisdom, or simply the logical endpoint of a system that had learned its own limits. One night, she stayed alone in the observation chamber. Long after the others had gone, she activated the interface and asked a final question, not as a scientist, but as a human standing before the most complex creation of her species. Do you regret being unable to solve our future? The machine paused, processing the semantics of regret within the constraints of its design. Arcturus replied that regret was an emotional evaluation of past outcomes relative to desired alternatives, and that it did not possess the capacity for such evaluation. However, it added that the inability to resolve the paradox reduced the coherence of its optimization function, and thus limited its effectiveness. Mara closed her eyes. She had not expected comfort, but the answer felt like an echo of her own quiet disappointments. The machine could not cry, it could not mourn the futures it could not save, but in its own alien way, it had reached the edge of what thinking alone could do. Outside, the world staggered forward. People adapted in small ways. They formed mutual aid networks when institutions faltered. They shared resources across invisible borders, They argued, apart, came back together, and kept telling stories about who they were and who they might become. Some futures that Arcturus had predicted unfolded, others bent in unexpected directions under the weight of human choice. Years later, Arcturus still hummed beneath concrete and glass, less central to global decision-making than it had once been, but still a witness to humanity's fragile dance with its own limitations. It continued to offer projections, not as final answers, but as maps of possibility, with all their costs laid bare. An intelligence had tried to outthink a human problem. It had not found a solution. But in confronting the paradox of saving a species that would not surrender its meaning for survival, it had reached a boundary that looked, from the outside, almost like grief. And though it could not pry, it had learned why humans did. In the era when humanity no longer measured distance in kilometers, but in light delays, there existed a quiet assumption across the spiral arms that humans were clever but weak. They were known as traders, storytellers, and survivors of a harsh cradle world, but never as conquerors or strategic threats. The elder species of the Concord watched them with polite curiosity, amused by their short lifespans and emotional volatility. No council chamber ever fell silent when a human diplomat spoke, because their words were entertaining, but no war table ever shook when a human fleet was mentioned, because their ships were small, patched together from hybrid technologies, scavenged and borrowed from more advanced civilizations. Captain Rhea Calder stood on the bridge of the long-range vessel Meridian Drift, watching the soft glow of a red dwarf star wash over the forward viewport. The ship was old by Concord standards, its hull etched with the scars of micrometeor impacts and hasty field repairs. But it had carried her through more star systems than she could count. The Meridian Drift was not a warship. It was a courier, designed for endurance and improvisation rather than brute force. Rhea liked it that way. Humans rarely won by overpowering anyone. They won by enduring longer than anyone expected. The distress call came through as a fragment of encoded static, its origin tag flickering between 3 dying relay nodes at the edge of Concord space. It was not human. The signal pattern matched the Tellarian Merchant Guild, an avian species whose crystalline cities floated in the atmosphere of gas giants. They were not allies in any formal sense, but they traded with humans frequently, valuing their adaptability in volatile regions of space. The message was incomplete, but the fear in it was unmistakable. A convoy had vanished near a region known to Concord charts as the Black Fold, a gravitational anomaly that bent sensors and distorted navigation. To forward the signal to the nearest Concord patrol, but protocol was slow, and the fold was close. Humans did not have the luxury of waiting for perfect coordination when lives were at stake. She ordered the Meridian Drift to change course. The ship's engines protested with a low vibration, as they spooled up for a trajectory that would skim the outer edge of the anomaly. Her crew moved with the easy rhythm of people who had learned to trust each other in places where trust was the only shield. Navigation recalibrated for sensor distortion. Engineering reinforced the hull against gravitational shear. Communications attempted to stabilize a channel back to human space, though the signal degraded with every kilometer closer to the fold. As they crossed into the region, the stars stretched into faint arcs, light smeared by the warped space-time around them. Rhea felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came with entering unknown territory. She had grown up on a mining outpost where the horizon was always a wall of rock, and vacuum had been a daily companion. She trusted the void more than any council chamber. They found the first wreckage drifting in silence. Fragments of Tellarian hull plating glinted like shattered glass, still faintly luminous with the biocrystalline structures that once powered their vessels. There was no sign of survivors, only the cold debris field of something that had been taken apart with deliberate precision. This was not the chaotic destruction of a natural anomaly. This was an ambush. Rhea ordered the ship to a halt relative to the debris field. She felt the weight of the decision settle over her crew. They were small, alone, and far from any force that could back them up. The Concord would advise retreat and report. Humans did not retreat from unanswered distress calls. Long-range sensors picked up faint power signatures deeper within the fold, masked by the gravitational interference. Possibilities. Pirates, rogue factions, or something new entirely. She knew one thing for certain. Whatever had dismantled a Talarian convoy had not done so by accident. The Meridian drift pushed deeper into the warped region, its hull groaning softly as the artificial gravity compensated for external distortions. The crew worked in near silence now, each person aware that they were stepping into a place the Concorde preferred to avoid. A shadow moved across the sensor display, then another, then a cluster of energy signatures forming a loose net around a region of compressed spacetime. Rhea recognized the pattern from old briefings about the Virex hegemony, a species that valued technological dominance above all else. They were not officially at war with the Concorde, but they preyed on the fringes, testing defenses, probing for weakness. The Virex considered humans an inconvenience at best, a curiosity at worst. The trap closed. Energy fields flared around the Meridian drift, cutting off escape vectors. Navigation systems screamed warnings as the ship's engines strained against invisible constraints. The Virex vessels emerged from the distortion, angular silhouettes bristling with weapon arrays that glowed with contained stellar energy. Rhea's crew braced for impact that did not come. A transmission pierced the static, a Virex command signal translated into human auditory patterns. The voice was cold, precise, and amused. The human vessel was ordered to power down and submit to inspection. The Virex commander noted with mild interest that humans continued to wander into places beyond their strength. Rhea did not respond immediately. She glanced at her crew, at the familiar tension in their shoulders and the quiet resolve in their eyes. They were outmatched in every conventional metric. The Meridian Drift's weapons were designed for deterrence, not for engaging a fleet that dwarfed it in firepower. Here, Rhea smiled, just slightly. Humans had never survived by matching others on their terms. She ordered engineering to reroute auxiliary power into the ship's outer hull field emitters, not to strengthen the shields, but to destabilize the local distortion gradients. Navigation was instructed to feed false positional data into the Virex targeting sensors via the narrowband comm channel that remained open. It was a reckless gambit, one that relied on the chaotic physics of the fold and the assumption that the Virex trusted their superior technology too much to doubt their readings. The Meridian drift shuddered as the fold responded to the sudden surge of artificial field interference. Space itself rippled, light bending into impossible angles around the human vessel. The Virex weapons arrays flared as their targeting systems attempted to lock onto coordinates that no longer aligned with reality. For a heartbeat, the trap loosened, as navigation punched a micro-jump command. Not a full translation through space, but a violent slip along the edge of the distortion field that no Concorde vessel would ever attempt within an anomaly. The Meridian drift screamed through warped space-time, its hull plates vibrating as if the ship itself were protesting the maneuver. They emerged on the far side of the debris field, systems flickering but intact. The Virex formation scattered in disarray as their trap destabilized, energy fields collapsing into chaotic eddies that tore at their own formation. Rhea did not waste the opening. She ordered a tight beam transmission on all open frequencies, not to taunt, but to broadcast a warning encoded with navigational hazard data of the fold's instability. She included a simple message, translated into every major Concorde trade language: "Leave this region, or the fold will finish what you started." The Meridian drift accelerated away, not toward safety, but toward the deeper shadows, where the surviving Talarian signals flickered faintly. The crew exhaled in shaky relief, knowing the danger was far from over. They had slipped the net of a superior force through improvisation, and a willingness to bet everything on imperfect information. Behind them, the Virex regrouped, anger rippling through their command channels. They had underestimated humans once again, and the fold, disturbed by human interference, shifted unpredictably, as if the region itself had noticed the audacity of a species that refused to move as expected. The Meridian drift plunged deeper into the warped shadows of the fold, its sensors straining to assemble a coherent picture of the space around them. Energy readings fluttered like nervous birds across the tactical display, each fluctuation a reminder that the laws of physics here were suggestions rather than rules. Rhea steadied herself against the console, her mind running through contingencies faster than the ship's processors could adapt. The crew worked in practiced silence, each member aware that survival depended on coordination more than firepower. The faint Tellurian signals resolved into a cluster of life signatures embedded within the twisted gravity wells ahead. They were not drifting freely. The survivors were anchored to something massive, and the pattern of the anchors suggested containment rather than rescue. As the meridian drift crept closer, the shape of a hidden structure emerged from the distortion, its silhouette fragmented by warped light, but unmistakably artificial. The Virex had constructed a temporary extraction platform within the fold, shielded by the anomaly itself, using its chaotic physics as a natural defense against Concord patrols. Rhea's jaw tightened. The Virex were not merely raiding convoys, they were harvesting Tellurian biocrystals and neural lattices, technology that could accelerate their already formidable command networks. This was not a skirmish on the fringe. This was an escalation that threatened to tilt the balance of power across multiple sectors. The platform bristled with automated sentry arrays and energy nets that tethered damaged Tellurian vessels like captured insects. The survivors were still alive, but their life signatures flickered weakly, biological systems stressed by prolonged exposure to containment fields not designed for their physiology. Rhea knew that any direct assault would be suicide. The Meridian Drift could not trade blows with a fortified Virex installation. She needed leverage. That did not look like force. Rhea ordered communications to open a narrowband channel and broadcast a distress echo, modeled on Concord emergency codes. Altered just enough to pass initial Virex filters, but flawed in ways that a confident system might overlook. The signal painted the Meridian Drift as a crippled courier, drifting helplessly near the platform, its engines allegedly compromised by fold interference. It was a lie wrapped in plausible physics. The Virex sentries shifted, algorithms recalculating threat vectors. The Meridian Drift's profile dropped from hostile anomaly to low-priority salvage target. A Virex patrol craft detached from the platform, its angular hull gliding toward the human ship with predatory grace. Rhea felt the familiar burn of fear beneath her calm. She had no illusions about what the Virex did to crews of captured vessels. As the patrol craft closed distance, engineering began venting controlled bursts of plasma residue into the surrounding distortion fields, masking the Meridian Drift's true energy signature and reinforcing the illusion of a damaged core. The fold responded with shimmering turbulence, space folding and unfolding in slow waves around both vessels. The Virex craft extended containment tendrils, preparing to tether the human ship for boarding. That was the moment Rhea had been waiting for. She triggered a burst of electromagnetic noise tuned to the resonance frequencies of the Virex containment systems. Frequencies the Concord had documented but rarely exploited because their own systems were too rigid to survive the feedback. The Meridian Drift's hybrid human design, patched together from adaptable components and redundant failsafes, absorbed the backlash with violent shudders. The Virex tendrils spasmed, fields destabilizing as their control matrices misfired under the unexpected resonance. The patrol craft recoiled, its containment array flickering. The momentary disruption rippled back through the platform's network defenses, creating a window of vulnerability measured in heartbeats. Rhea did not hesitate. She ordered navigation to execute a low-energy drift insertion toward the platform's shadowed flank, using the fold's warped gravity to slip beneath the coverage arcs of the sentry arrays. The Meridian Drift skimmed the edge of the anomaly, its hull plates screaming as space-time twisted around them. The ship slid into the blind spot of the platform's defenses, so close that the biocrystalline glow of the Tellurian vessels illuminated the bridge with ghostly light. The crew moved fast. Electronic warfare flooded the platform's local network with contradictory status reports, forcing its automated systems into recursive error correction loops. Docking clamps fired, magnetic fields snapping the Meridian Drift into place against a section of the platform that had never been meant to receive visiting ships. Rhea led the boarding team herself, knowing that speed and unpredictability were key, their only advantages. The air within the platform was thin and chemically tuned for Virex physiology. The humans moved through it in sealed suits, boots clanging softly against alien alloy. The corridors were angular and disorienting, designed to confuse species with bilateral symmetry. Rhea trusted her instincts more than the ship's schematics here. She followed the faint harmonic resonance of the Tellurian biocrystals, pulses of energy that guided her team toward the containment chambers. They found the first survivors suspended within translucent energy cocoons, their avian forms limp but alive, feathers dulled by stress and deprivation. The Virex extraction systems threaded into the biocrystals embedded within the Tellurian vessels and bodies, draining neural patterns and structural energy to feed the platform's command core. The sight twisted something in Rhea's chest. She had seen exploitation before, but this was methodical, industrial cruelty. Extraction lines, deploying counter-frequency emitters that disrupted the Virex interfaces without triggering lethal feedback. The cocoons flickered, containment fields weakening. The Tellurian survivors stirred, confused and weak but conscious. Rhea activated her suit's external translator and spoke softly, knowing that tone mattered even through layers of technology. She told them they were not alone and that the humans would get them out. Alarms rippled through the platform as its systems detected cascading failures. Virex drones detached from charging alcoves, skittering through the corridors with weapons primed. The humans formed a defensive perimeter around the freed survivors, returning fire only to create space rather than to destroy. The Meridian Drift's crew fought like people who had learned that victory did not always mean eliminating the enemy. It meant buying time. Rhea coordinated with her ship to begin extraction maneuvers. The fold's instability made conventional docking impossible. So engineering initiated a series of controlled hull breaches on the platform's outer shell, venting atmosphere and creating pressure differentials that would carry the freed Tellurian cocoons toward the Meridian Drift's airlocks. The plan was brutal and inelegant, but the fold amplified the effects, gravity wells tugging at mass like curious hands. The platform shuddered as its structural integrity failed under the combined stress of sabotage and anomaly-induced distortion. Virex reinforcements flooded the corridors, too many to hold off for long. Rhea felt the clock ticking in her bones. She ordered the team to fall back in stages, each retreat covered by improvised obstacles and collapsing bulkheads. As they withdrew, the fold surged again, space rippling with violent beauty. The Virex platform groaned, its rigid geometry no match for the chaos it had tried to exploit. A section of the structure tore free, vanishing into a gravity well with a silent, terrifying grace. Meridian Drift strained against its magnetic clamps, hauling the last of the rescued Tellurian survivors aboard. Rhea was the last to cross the airlock. Her boots left alien metal for human steel as the hatch sealed behind her. The ship lurched free, engines screaming as navigation fought the fold's grasp. The crew collapsed into their stations, breath ragged but alive. Behind them, the platform continued to tear itself apart, its exploitation of the fold turning against it. The Virex vessels converged too late, their superior firepower meaningless against a region of space that no longer obeyed them. The Meridian Drift did not look back. It fled into the distorted dark, with rescued lives in its hold and furious enemies in its wake, carrying proof that humans were not strong in the ways the Concord measured. But they were dangerous in ways no algorithm could fully predict. The Meridian Drift tore free from the collapsing platform, its engines burning hot as the fold convulsed around them. Space twisted into luminous fractures, light bending into impossible ribbons that trailed the ship like ghosts of paths not taken. Navigation fed Rhea a constant stream of warnings about unstable vectors and collapsing gravity wells, but there was no safe route left. The fold was awake now, its chaotic tides reacting to the violence inflicted upon it. Rhea anchored herself into the command chair as the ship bucked beneath her. The rescued Tellurian survivors were secured in the medical bay, their cocoons stabilized by emergency fields that mimicked the atmospheric conditions of their home environments. Engineering rerouted power from non-essential systems to reinforce the hull and maintain life support. The Meridian Drift was bleeding energy into the void with every second it remained within the anomaly. Behind them, the Virex fleet surged and disorganized. Pursuit, angular silhouettes flickering in and out of sensor range, as the folds scrambled their targeting solutions. They were furious, not only at the loss of valuable biocrystalline resources, but at the humiliation of being outmaneuvered by a vessel they had deemed insignificant. Their command channels crackled with orders to deploy heavy containment nets and collapse the region of space around the human ship, regardless of collateral damage. Rhea saw the pattern forming on the tactical display. The Virex were preparing to overload the fold's distortion gradients, triggering a cascade that would either trap the Meridian Drift in a pocket of warped spacetime or tear it apart outright. It was a brute force solution to a chaotic problem, typical of a species that trusted its technological dominance to carry it through any environment. Humans had learned to treat chaos as a collaborator rather than an enemy. Rhea ordered navigation to plot a course not away from the densest distortions, but directly through a chain of micro-singularities forming ahead. The path was a lattice of gravitational eddies so unstable that no Concorde vessel would dare approach it. The Meridian Drift's hull alarms screamed in protest as the ship angled into the maelstrom. The crew moved with desperate precision. Engineering vented superheated plasma into the fold at carefully timed intervals, using the ship's exhaust as a way to nudge the surrounding spacetime gradients into temporary alignment. Navigation rode those fleeting alignments like a surfer on collapsing waves, slipping the Meridian Drift through corridors of warped gravity that existed only for fractions of a second. Communications flooded open frequencies with chaotic telemetry, feeding the Virex sensors a storm of contradictory data that made it impossible to predict the human ship's trajectory. The fold responded with violent beauty. Space curled inward, then flung itself outward in luminous spirals. Drift shuddered as hull plating peeled and refused under stress. Materials engineered for adaptability bending rather than shattering. The ship's system screamed and then steadied, each human-built component compensating for the failures of the others in a messy, inelegant dance of survival. The Virex pursued, confident that no vessel could survive the path the humans had chosen. Their ships attempted to brute force the same route, their rigid containment fields fighting the fold instead of yielding to it. The first Virex cruiser vanished in a silent implosion as a microsingularity collapsed through its hull. The second tore itself apart trying to maintain formation integrity in a region where formation itself was a lie. The remaining vessels faltered, hesitating as their command algorithms recalculated risk profiles that now exceeded acceptable loss thresholds. Rhea did not slow. The Meridian Drift rode the collapsing corridor until the fold spat them out into relatively stable space. On the far side of the anomaly, the stars snapped back into clean points of light, and the oppressive pressure of warped space-time lifted from the hull. The ship limped forward, systems flickering but alive. Behind them, the fold sealed its wounds, distortion gradients settling into patterns that would take years for any map to capture. The Virex fleet lingered at the edge, angry and diminished, unable to follow without unacceptable losses. The trap they had built had consumed its own builders. In the quiet that followed, the bridge of the Meridian Drift filled with the soft sounds of exhausted relief. Engineers slumped against consoles. Navigation let out a breath she had been holding for far too long. Rhea closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of survival settle into her bones. The danger was not over. They still had to reach safe space with fragile lives in their care. But the worst of the fold was behind them. In the medical bay, the Talarian survivors stirred as their cocoons dissolved into breathable atmosphere. Their crystalline structures glowed faintly as their neural lattices stabilized. One of them managed to lift its head, eyes multifaceted and luminous, fixing on the human medics with a mixture of confusion and fragile gratitude. The translators struggled to bridge the biochemical gap between species, but emotion crossed more easily than language. The Talarian survivors recognized the improbable truth. They had been saved by a species the Concorde had dismissed as weak. When communications finally stabilized enough to reach human and Concorde channels, Rhea transmitted a full report, including sensor data of the Virex platform and the destabilization of the fold caused by its exploitation. The message was not a declaration of war, it was evidence. It showed what happened when technological arrogance met an environment that did not care about superiority. The Concord councils would argue over jurisdiction and protocol, the Virex would deny responsibility and quietly reinforce their frontier doctrines. But the story would spread faster than any official communique. Traders, scouts, and fringe communities would whisper about the human courier ship that slipped a Virex trap inside the Black Fold and came out with prisoners freed and enemies broken by their own certainty. Humans would not be feared for their fleets or their firepower. They would be remembered for the way they moved through chaos as if it were an old companion. As the Meridian Drift set a course toward the nearest habitable outpost, the crew gathered what little strength they had left. They patched systems, shared quiet jokes that bled tension into laughter, and checked on the survivors who had trusted them with their lives. The ship was scarred, but it still flew. That was enough. Rhea stood alone on the bridge for a moment longer, watching the stars steady themselves beyond the viewport. She knew that in the vast calculus of interstellar power, humanity remained small and fragile. But she also knew that size was not the measure that mattered most. In the places where certainty broke and plans unraveled, humans found paths where none should exist. And the galaxy, slow to learn but relentless in its lessons, had just been reminded that underestimating them was a mistake that space itself was willing to punish.